First Ladies of the United States of America. Part 1. American Queens. For a nation which long ago rejected royalty, the First Lady holds a position very much like a queen consort. When the United States elects a new president, they are often also voting for their spouse. But the title of First Lady hasn't always meant the president's wife. 11 of them were the daughters, sisters, or other relatives of the commander-in-chief. And they weren't always called First Lady. That title was coined in the mid-1800s. The unelected, unpaid White House hostesses have the considerable duty of smoothing the way for diplomacy, preserving White House history, and humanizing the president's image. Their personal triumphs and tragedies are played out on a worldwide stage. They influence the nation as fashion icons, social activists, and arbiters of change. Some First Ladies have had major influence on policy in a nation where women are still underrepresented in government, which has yet to elect a woman president. In this 6-part series, we'll meet the 53 fascinating women who have served as First Lady and see how the role has evolved over the past 2.5 centuries. Martha Dandridge Washington was the eldest of 8 children, born to a Virginia plantation owner. At 18, she married wealthy planter Daniel Parke Custis. The couple had 4 children: Daniel, who died at the age of 2, Frances, who died just before her 4th birthday, and John and Patsy, who would survive into adulthood. Her husband died of a heart attack at age 45 and left 25-year-old Martha a very rich widow. She ran 5 plantations with over 17,000 acres. She also inherited 300 enslaved people. Her wealth and good nature made Martha a very attractive prospect among the local bachelors, and within 2 years she had accepted the proposal of decorated veteran of the French and Indian War, George Washington. The couple had a lavish wedding. The groom wore a suit of blue and silver cloth with red trim, and the bride wore shoes dyed purple, the most costly color available. They settled into his plantation, Mount Vernon, where they ran their 2 massive concerns and raised John and Patsy. The couple expected more children to come along, but they never did. Historians speculate that a youthful bout of smallpox might have left George infertile. George and Martha got on well and had a solid and faithful marriage. George had great respect for his wife and her abilities. Together, they built up their wealth and property, joining the social elite of Virginia. At the age of 16, Patsy suffered an epileptic seizure and died in her stepfather's arms. In 1758, George was elected to the Virginia legislature and began to publicly oppose British taxation. When the Revolution broke out in 1775, George raced to Philadelphia to join the Continental Congress. While there, he was unanimously elected the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Martha did a great deal to support the Revolutionary War effort. Each autumn, she packed up cloth, canned fruit and vegetables, and dried meats, and endured the multi-day journey over rough terrain to join her husband wherever the army was camped for the winter. Martha was under constant threat of kidnap by the British, but she determined to set an example of courage. Soldiers cheered when Lady Washington entered the camp. During the war, she served as the general's social hostess, entertaining the officers with dinners and parties, once staying up all night dancing with General Nathanael Greene's wife Kitty. Martha's only surviving child, John Parke Custis, served as an aide-de-camp to his stepfather, but John died of dysentery at 26. Overwhelmed, John's widow sent the youngest of her 4 children, Eleanor 2 and George 6 months, to be raised by their grandmother at Mount Vernon. Martha and George doted on their grandchildren. In 1781, the Revolutionary Army defeated the British Army at the Battle of Yorktown, and George Washington accepted Cornwallis's surrender. Now freed of British rule, George was eager to return home to Virginia. He arrived at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve and fell back into his domestic felicity with Martha. But by 1787, the call to help build a new government grew loud, and George left home again to attend the Constitutional Convention. In 1789, George was elected the first President of the United States of America. Martha had reservations about her husband accepting the office, but she determined to support him in this historic role. The couple left Mount Vernon and traveled to New York City, the capital at the time, to lead the new nation and define the office of president and his wife. The title of First Lady was not established until the 1860s. Nonetheless, Martha, known as Lady Washington, set a precedence for the role as a social hostess. Much like the Queen's consort of Europe, she was the head of the Republican court. She held weekly salons, hosted visiting dignitaries, and organized public receptions for her husband in an effort to project a dignified public image for the office. The first couple occupied 3 presidential mansions during George's 8 years in office. The first on Cherry Street in New York City, the second on Broadway, and the third in Philadelphia when the capital temporarily moved there. The couple's grandchildren, Eleanor and George, lived with them and helped to entertain guests. The Washingtons also brought with them a number of enslaved people who waited on them and ran the presidential households. As the laws of the North allowed for enslaved people to claim their freedom after 6 months, they rotated the people they brought from Mount Vernon in order to deny them their liberty. A few did manage to escape, though, including their cook, Hercules. In 1797, after serving 2 terms as president, George made the remarkable decision to leave the office and return home. Many supported him remaining in office for life or even becoming the King of the United States. The fact that he didn't have any biological children to pass the office down to may have been an important factor in this outcome. George spent his final years with Martha at Mount Vernon. He died in 1799, age 67. One of the many legends of George Washington is that he freed all of the enslaved people he had owned when he died. But in reality, they were only to be freed after Martha's death. She began to fear those around her, and after a mysterious fire and rumors that one of the cooks was planning to poison her, she was compelled to grant freedom to the people George had owned. But many were spouses, parents, or children of the enslaved people she and her heirs owned who would never be set free. So the proclamation broke up many families. Martha's health declined after the death of her husband. She died 2.5 years later at the age of 70. George and Martha Washington are buried side by side on the Mount Vernon estate. Abigail Smith Adams was the daughter of a Massachusetts minister. She and her 3 sisters were not offered a formal education, as their brother was, a fact that Abigail resented all her life. But they were educated by their mother and grandmother and read widely. When Abigail was 15, her older sister's fiancé brought a friend to dinner, a 24-year-old country lawyer named John Adams. Abigail's mother was not impressed with John and said his manners still reeked of the farm. But Abigail saw something in her suitor, and her parents agreed to the match. The newlyweds mounted a single horse to ride home to John's small cottage. Abigail had 6 children in the first 12 years of their marriage. Abigail, John Quincy, the future 6th President of the United States, Grace, who died at 2, Charles, Thomas, and Elizabeth, who was stillborn. The family moved to Boston for several years, but returned to the country during the lead-up to the Revolutionary War, when Boston became too dangerous. As John traveled to the Continental Congress, Abigail managed the family and the farm. She invested her husband's money wisely in Revolutionary War bonds, which paid off handsomely after the war was won. Abigail and John wrote hundreds of letters back and forth, and it is clear that he prized her opinion, advice, and approval. In her most famous letter, she instructed John to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound to any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Sadly, John laughed off his wife's request. Remember the ladies became a popular slogan of the suffragette movement over a century later. Following the American victory, John was appointed ambassador to France, and Abigail and their 2 eldest children accompanied him. Though initially fearful of the journey, Abigail grew to love Paris, where she made many friends and developed a great passion for theater and opera. The next year, John was appointed ambassador to Great Britain, but Abigail did not care for London, where she was cold-shouldered by polite society. After 4 years in Europe, the family returned to Massachusetts. In 1789, John was elected the first vice president of the U.S., serving under George Washington. In 1797, John was elected the 2nd president of the United States. His wife accompanied him to Philadelphia and filled the role Martha Washington had established of social hostess. But Abigail was not content to simply throw state dinners and parties. She was active in politics and was, as always, her husband's most trusted political advisor. His rivals took to calling her Mrs. President. In 1800, the Adamses relocated to the new federal capital, Washington, D.C., and moved into what was then called the President's House, now known as the White House. The mansion was still under construction, and the new city around it was only just emerging from the wilderness. The swampy locale was cold and damp, and Abigail had trouble finding domestic servants to help her run the large household and chop firewood for the fires that needed to be kept constantly lit. She took to hanging up laundry in the East Room to keep it out of the rain. The 4 months they spent there took a toll on her health. She was also caring for the children of several relatives, including those of her son Charles, who had recently died from alcoholism. Abigail staunchly supported her husband, even planting favorable stories about him in the press. She backed his passage of the Alien and Sedition Act, which made immigration to the U.S. much more difficult, and was so unpopular that it cost Adams a 2nd term in office. When he was defeated in the election of 1800, the family returned to Peacefield, Massachusetts, where Abigail continued to raise her grandchildren and watch after John Quincy's children while he served as ambassador to Russia. She lived to see her son appointed Secretary of State, but died at 73 of typhoid fever before he was elected president. John lived to the age of 90 and was then laid to rest next to her. Thomas Jefferson was deeply in love with his wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, but she died in 1782 at the age of 33 after giving birth to their 6th child. On her deathbed, she made Thomas promise never to remarry, as she feared her children being raised by an unkind stepmother, as she had been. Thomas kept his word and remained single, but he was far from celibate. He coerced an enslaved woman he owned, Sally Hemings, who was his late wife's half-sister, into a sexual relationship. Sally gave birth to 6 children who were enslaved on Thomas's Monticello plantation and made to serve his white children. When the widower was elected president in 1800, he needed a social hostess, so he enlisted his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, nicknamed Patsy. Patsy was only 10 years old when her mother died, and she supported her father through his monumental grief. From 12 to 17, she lived in Paris while her father served as ambassador. She lived at a convent school and was educated alongside the daughters of the French elite. She became a witty conversationalist and was fluent in 4 languages. Patsy told her father that she wanted to convert to Catholicism and become a nun. He immediately withdrew her from the school. When the French Revolution broke out, Thomas took his family back to Virginia. At 18, Patsy married her 3rd cousin, Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., who was a descendant of Pocahontas. The couple moved to Randolph's plantation, and Patsy gave birth to 12 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood. During Jefferson's 8 years as president, Patsy visited Washington often and served as her father's social hostess. She was also his confidant and was highly respected for her intelligence. She assured everyone that the rumors about her father and Sally Hemings were not true. Patsy's husband was also in Washington, where he served in the House of Representatives. When Patsy was unavailable, her younger sister, Mary, also served as the president's hostess, but she died in childbirth in 1804. After Jefferson's retirement, Patsy and her children lived primarily at Monticello. Her husband was elected governor of Virginia, but they lived apart as he succumbed to alcoholism and mental instability. Patsy organized her father's papers for publication, editing them to cover up his relationship with Sally Hemings and generally putting him in the best possible light. Upon Thomas's death in 1826, Patsy inherited Monticello, but the family's finances were in disarray. She sold most of the enslaved people she owned, tearing families apart. Monticello was also sold, but Patsy got only 1/10 of its value. She spent her remaining years moving around and living with her adult children. Patsy died in 1836 and was buried at Monticello near her parents. Dolly Payne Madison was born in North Carolina into a Quaker family with 8 children. Following the Revolution, Dolly's father was among the Quaker plantation owners who emancipated their enslaved people. The family then moved to Philadelphia. At 22, Dolly married lawyer John Todd and had 2 sons. In 1793, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia, killing over 5,000 people. Dolly lost her baby son, her husband, and her in-laws. The money her husband had left her was withheld by his brother, and Dolly had to sue him to get money to live on. Women of the time had few respectable means of earning a living, so Dolly was under pressure to remarry. She was beautiful and charming, with jet black hair and striking blue eyes. She met many prospective second husbands among the politicians drawn to Philadelphia while it was serving as the temporary U.S. capital. She was staying in a boarding house where one Aaron Burr also resided. The senator introduced her to his longtime friend, Representative James Madison of Virginia, author of the U.S. Constitution. After 3 months of courtship, Dolly agreed to marry James. She was expelled from the Quaker Society of Friends for marrying outside the faith. Though he was 17 years her senior and she was in dire need of a new husband, the pair had a genuine fondness for each other. Dolly was attractive, lively, and sociable, while James was timid, pedantic, and studious. He suffered ill health throughout his life, including episodes of what was likely epilepsy. He and Dolly didn't have any children together, but James was a father to her son. After 8 years in the house, James retired from politics. The family moved to Montpelier, his plantation in Virginia, where they lived contentedly for 3 years. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected president, and he asked Madison to serve as his Secretary of State. Dolly was instrumental to President Jefferson. As both he and his vice president, Aaron Burr, were widowers, Dolly served as a social hostess during many events. Jefferson caused a diplomatic crisis when, charmed by Dolly, he escorted her into the dining room and left the wife of the British ambassador behind. Dolly selected many of the furnishings and decor for the presidential mansion. In 1808, Jefferson stepped down and Madison was elected president, much to the credit of his wife's popularity and charisma. She threw the first inaugural ball and began the tradition of first ladies wearing white gowns to the event. Dolly opened the White House for public events in a stylish yet accessible way that appealed greatly to the American people. She held weekly parties called squeezes because so many people from both political parties tried to squeeze into the White House. Dolly was a highly intelligent and cunning woman, and she used the tools available to her: charm, persuasion, and coveted invitations to her parties to get male politicians on board with the political policies she supported. At one such squeeze, Dolly dipped snuff with the Speaker of the House. She was the only First Lady ever granted a seat on the floor of Congress. One of James's political opponents said it was unfair that he had to run against both Madisons. James won re-election in 1812, the same year the U.S. and Great Britain went back to war over trade and territory. The British Army attacked Washington, and Dolly was forced to flee the White House before it was set on fire. With the British closing in, Dolly stayed until the last minute to save important documents and the portrait of George Washington. This act of heroism made her a national hero. The war left many children fatherless, so Dolly set up the Female Orphan Asylum to house and educate orphaned girls. In 1817, after 17 years at the center of Washington's social life, Dolly and James retired to Montpelier Plantation. Their son, John, moved to Philadelphia, where he racked up gambling debts and landed himself in prison. The Madisons were forced to mortgage half of their estate to pay off his debts. James died in 1836 at the age of 85. Bored and lonely in the country, Dolly went back to Washington at 69. She moved in with her sister Anna in a house on Lafayette Square, right across from the White House. She left Montpelier in the care of her son, who neglected it to ruin. Dolly was near destitute and sold the rest of the plantation, her enslaved servants, and her husband's political papers to pay off debts and have money to live on. Though she no longer had money to throw glittering dinner parties of her own, she still had many friends and remained incredibly popular. Dignitaries visiting the president would often call on the widow Madison across the street, and it was said that it wasn't really a party unless she was present. She also acted as a mentor to younger first ladies. Dolly died in 1849 at 81, and a huge funeral was held to honor her. She was eulogized by sitting President Zachary Taylor, who called her the First Lady of the nation, the first time the term First Lady was used. Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe was born in New York City into a prominent Dutch family. Her mother died in childbirth when she was 9. A year later, the family's home was destroyed by fire during the Revolution. Elizabeth was brought up by her 4 older sisters, who taught her social grace and elegance from a young age. The beautiful sisters attracted young gentlemen, including 26-year-old farmer and lawyer James Monroe of Virginia, who was in town while serving in the Continental Congress. 17-year-old Elizabeth wed James at her father's home. In 1794, James was appointed ambassador to France. The family lived in Paris during the Reign of Terror, when thousands of people were arrested and guillotined by the French Republican government. Elizabeth helped to secure the release of Madame Lafayette, wife of the American Revolutionary hero Marquis de Lafayette. The Monroes returned to Virginia, where James was elected governor. There, Elizabeth gave birth to her second child, a son, James Jr., who died at just 16 months. Elizabeth suffered the first of several seizures, possibly epilepsy, which would plague her for the rest of her life and force her to restrict her social activities. Next, James was appointed ambassador to Britain and Spain. Elizabeth found the British cold and resentful of Americans. The couple traveled to France to attend Napoleon's coronation as emperor. Monroe was elected president in 1816, as the White House had been set on fire and damaged during the War of 1812. Elizabeth hosted the inaugural ball at their private residence on I Street. She was often ill and handed off hostessing duties to her eldest daughter, Eliza. Both mother and daughter were considered haughty and arrogant. They made access to the White House more exclusive, which offended Democratic Americans. Upon leaving office, the Monroes were deeply in debt, owing to not being reimbursed for throwing presidential social events and the neglect of their plantation. They sold Highland Plantation and retired near Washington, D.C. Elizabeth collapsed near a fireplace and suffered severe burns. She died in 1830, age 62. James died a year later. They were initially buried separately, but were both exhumed and laid side by side at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. In the next video, we'll meet the first ladies of the early 1800s, including an actress, a teacher who built the White House Library, one who prayed her husband would lose his election, and one whose bigamous marriage pushed her husband to kill a man in a duel. Don't want to wait for the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all my multi-part series. For as little as $1 a month, you can become a patron and help me make more fascinating history videos. To join, check out the link in the description. Thank you for watching. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts.